It all started innocently enough, or so it seemed at first. I had noticed subtle changes in his behavior over the past few weeks, small but unmistakable shifts that made me curious. There was a spring in his step that hadn't been there before, a sudden attentiveness to his phone, and that peculiar glint in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. At first, I brushed it off as him being excited about something work-related or perhaps a fleeting mood. But then the patterns began to emerge, and it became increasingly difficult to ignore. The mornings when he claimed to be busy with errands that never really required his presence, the evenings when he seemed to vanish at the most convenient times, and the vague, almost rehearsed explanations when I asked questions. All of these were subtle breadcrumbs leading me to suspect that something was hidden, something significant. I began paying closer attention, not in a way that would be obvious, but like a careful observer, someone piecing together a puzzle without wanting to alarm the other side. It was during one of these ordinary days, the kind that blends seamlessly into the week, that the first real clue appeared. He had mentioned a work trip that didn't quite align with the usual schedule, and something about the way he delivered the information felt rehearsed, like a line from a script. The casual tone he tried to maintain was betrayed by the tension around his eyes, the slight hesitation before answering. I started tracking details, noticing the little inconsistencies that didn't make sense. There were receipts for places he claimed not to have visited, subtle mentions in conversation that contradicted earlier statements, and social media posts from friends that inadvertently referenced events he had denied attending. All of these hints piled up quietly but insistently, forming a map of a secret life that he thought was completely hidden from me. The more I observed, the more I realized how carefully he had tried to construct this illusion, crafting alibis and rehearsing explanations that were meant to withstand casual questioning. But in truth, no matter how meticulously he tried to control the narrative, there was always a trace, a sign that eventually betrayed him. My investigation was not driven by malice, but by an insatiable curiosity, a need to understand the truth behind the sudden changes in behavior that I could no longer ignore. Every small detail I noticed was a piece of evidence, a thread that, when pulled, threatened to unravel the carefully maintained facade. I began documenting everything in my mind, constructing timelines, comparing statements, and cross-referencing events. Each time he mentioned a meeting, an appointment, or a supposed work commitment, I checked for alignment with facts, subtly questioning without revealing that I had begun to see through the veil. The process became almost like solving a mystery, where every clue led to another, and the picture of his hidden plans became clearer and more undeniable. There were moments of doubt, of course, when I questioned whether I was overanalyzing, whether the small inconsistencies I observed were simply coincidences or normal human error. But my instincts told me otherwise, something about the pattern of secrecy, the repeated evasions, and the half-truths created a weight that could not be ignored. As the days passed, I found myself growing more confident in my observations, more convinced that the secret he was trying to hide was not minor, that it involved a level of premeditation and intention that could not be overlooked. The turning point came when I noticed the careful timing of his communications, the way he chose to speak about certain things only in passing, and the way he seemed to avoid direct answers when questioned too closely. It was then that I realized this was not just a fleeting distraction or a harmless deviation. This was a deliberate act of concealment, a secret carefully orchestrated to avoid detection. At that moment, I understood that the next steps I took would require careful planning, precision, and a clear understanding of both the risks and the potential outcomes. Discovering his secret holiday plans was not instantaneous. It was the result of patient observation, critical thinking, and an unwavering attention to detail. Each clue, each subtle inconsistency, each hint of deception built upon the last until I had a complete picture of what he was trying so hard to hide. What had begun as a vague suspicion transformed into undeniable certainty, and the realization of the truth set in motion a series of actions that would soon change everything about the narrative he thought he controlled. Bringing his boss into the picture was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a carefully calculated move that required thought, timing, and an understanding of the dynamics at play. Once I had uncovered the truth about his secret holiday plans, I knew that simply confronting him would not create the impact I intended. There had to be a way to reveal the deception so clearly, so unmistakably, that the reality could not be denied and the consequences could not be deflected. I considered different strategies, weighing the risks and the potential outcomes of each. The idea of involving his boss emerged as the most effective approach, a way to expose the situation with authority and undeniable weight, transforming what could have been a private embarrassment into a situation that carried real accountability. The planning began subtly, almost like setting a stage for a performance where every detail mattered. I had to ensure that the timing was perfect, that his boss would be present without him having the slightest inkling, and that the revelation would be clear without requiring extensive explanations. It was important that the encounter was natural, that nothing seemed forced or orchestrated in a way that could be questioned. I considered the logistics carefully, how to get his boss involved without alerting him, how to arrange the setting so that the meeting appeared coincidental, and how to ensure that I maintained control over the situation at all times. There was a thrill in orchestrating this plan, a sense of empowerment that came from knowing that I had the foresight and cunning to turn the tables in a way that was both unexpected and unavoidable. I contacted his boss under the guise of an unrelated matter, arranging a meeting that seemed perfectly ordinary on the surface. Meanwhile, I continued my observations, keeping an eye on his movements, noting the times and places where his secret might intersect with the planned encounter. Every step was calculated to maximize the impact, to ensure that when the moment arrived, there would be no room for doubt, no chance for evasion, and no ability for him to salvage the narrative he had carefully constructed. The anticipation built steadily as the day approached. I rehearsed in my mind how the interaction would unfold, imagining his reactions, the subtle shifts in his expressions, and the momentary panic that would cross his face when he realized who was entering the room. It was not about cruelty, but about justice, about demonstrating that deception, no matter how cleverly concealed, could not withstand the scrutiny of truth and accountability. On the day of the planned encounter, I moved with precision, ensuring that everything unfolded exactly as intended. The atmosphere was calm, almost deceptively ordinary, but beneath the surface, every detail was a part of the larger design. As we approached the location, I could sense the tension building, the subtle changes in his demeanor that confirmed he still had no idea what was coming. The presence of his boss, when finally revealed, carried an immediate weight that no argument or excuse could diminish. The surprise was palpable, and the realization that his carefully hidden plans were now exposed in front of someone with authority was evident in the way his posture shifted, the way his voice faltered, and the way his eyes betrayed a sudden recognition of the consequences. In that moment, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that the truth had been revealed in a way that left no room for denial, a validation of all the observation, patience, and careful planning that had led to this point. The strategy of bringing his boss was more than a dramatic reveal. It was a demonstration of the power of preparation, foresight, and understanding human behavior. It was about turning knowledge into action, about taking the subtle signs and inconsistencies that I had observed and using them to create an incontrovertible reality. The encounter also highlighted the importance of accountability in all its forms, showing that secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, carry consequences when discovered. I watched as the situation unfolded, noting the reactions, the subtle interplay of surprise, guilt, and the dawning awareness of being caught. The boss's presence elevated the revelation, adding an element of authority and seriousness that transformed a personal discovery into a moment with lasting impact. By carefully orchestrating the timing, the setting, and the participants, I was able to create a situation that was both revealing and instructive, demonstrating the lengths people go to hide the truth and the power of a well-planned, thoughtful response. Bringing his boss into the scenario was a calculated risk, one that required confidence, strategy, and patience, but it was precisely that combination of elements that made the revelation so effective. Every step, from the initial planning to the final execution, was driven by the desire to expose the truth in a way that was undeniable, impactful, and ultimately transformative the moment he realized the truth hit him like a wave. Sudden and inescapable, washing over every carefully constructed story he had told himself and others. It wasn't a slow dawning of comprehension, it was instantaneous, a flash of understanding that left him momentarily frozen, searching for words that could somehow undo what had just been revealed. I had seen him confident, assured, the kind of person who believed that his actions were invisible, that his plans were beyond scrutiny, and that the world could never catch up to him. But in that moment, all of that confidence evaporated, replaced by a raw, unfiltered vulnerability that was impossible to conceal. His eyes darted, looking for some escape, some way to control the narrative that had slipped so spectacularly from his grasp, but there was none. The very presence of his boss, combined with the knowledge that I had uncovered everything, created a tension so palpable that it seemed to fill the entire room. Every gesture, every movement, betrayed the sudden anxiety that gripped him. His attempts at casual conversation fell flat, stilted, and hollow, the words faltering in his mouth as he realized that explanation and excuse were useless in the face of undeniable evidence. The reactions were instantaneous yet complex, a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and the dawning awareness that his secret holiday plans were no longer his alone to manage. I watched as the layers of deception he had painstakingly constructed began to unravel, each small lie or omission now exposed under the scrutiny of observation, authority, and timing. There was a certain poetry to the moment, an almost cinematic quality to the way the situation unfolded, with every element, the setting, the participants, and the timing, working in concert to create an unavoidable revelation. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his posture, and tried, almost instinctively, to regain some semblance of control, but it was a futile effort. The subtle signs of panic, the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers fidgeted, the quickened pace of his breathing, spoke louder than any words he could have uttered. I could see the realization hitting him in layers. First, the understanding that his actions were known. Second, the awareness that the authority figure in the room had seen and understood. And third, the knowledge that the facade he had maintained was utterly shattered. It was fascinating to observe the cascade of emotions, how quickly a person can transition from arrogance to vulnerability, from confidence to self-consciousness, and how every carefully hidden detail suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. In that instant, the power dynamics shifted entirely. The confidence that had defined him, the assumption that he could manipulate the narrative or control perception, was replaced by the stark reality that the truth was now in the hands of those who had witnessed it. There was no room for maneuvering, no possibility of spinning the story to his advantage. He was exposed, and exposure is a powerful thing. It strips away pretenses, forces accountability, and makes every action subject to judgment. I could almost feel the weight of his realization pressing down, the way it altered the space between us, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. It was a lesson in human psychology, in the fragility of carefully constructed facades, and in the inevitability of truth when observation, timing, and authority intersect. His initial shock slowly gave way to a complex mixture of emotions, defensiveness, the faint glimmer of regret, and the beginning of a reluctant acknowledgement of the consequences he now faced. Even as he attempted to articulate explanations, the words stumbled and fell short, insufficient to cover the gap between perception and reality. The environment, carefully orchestrated, left him with no escape hatch, no ally, and no room for deception. It was as if every secret he had believed safe and every detail he had hidden were now laid bare, illuminated by the clarity of a moment he could neither control nor influence. Observing this unraveling was an exercise in understanding human behavior under pressure, how quickly a person can shift from confidence to disarray, and how accountability can strike with sudden force when all the elements align perfectly. It was a moment of revelation, not just for him but for everyone witnessing it, a striking illustration of what happens when secrecy and deception meet careful observation, strategy, and timing. I saw the rapid recalculation in his eyes, the way he assessed the consequences, and the immediate realization that the landscape had changed entirely. that the illusion of control he had so carefully maintained was no longer his to wield, and that every action moving forward would be colored by the knowledge that the truth had been revealed. The dynamics of power and accountability became strikingly clear the moment the truth was revealed. It was no longer just about a secret holiday or a hidden agenda. It was about how authority, responsibility, and personal choices intersect in ways that cannot be ignored. His boss's presence added an undeniable weight to the situation, transforming what could have been a private revelation into a moment with real consequences. The shift in power was immediate, subtle yet unmistakable, and it changed the entire atmosphere. The confidence he had carried into the situation, built over weeks of careful planning and concealment, began to crumble under the scrutiny of someone who held influence over his professional standing. There is a distinct difference between discovering a secret in isolation and witnessing that secret being acknowledged by someone whose role commands respect and oversight. In this case, that difference was everything. Accountability became the lens through which every action, every omission, and every deception was now evaluated. No longer could he rely on excuses, half-truths, or carefully rehearsed explanations. Every choice, every decision that led to this point was suddenly visible under the light of scrutiny. The interplay between authority and secrecy was fascinating to observe. His attempts to rationalize or minimize the situation were futile in the face of an undeniable truth and the presence of someone who had the capacity to affect real consequences. It highlighted the way people behave when the balance of power shifts unexpectedly, when control is perceived to be in their hands, but is suddenly revealed to reside elsewhere. The situation became a study in human psychology, in how the fear of repercussions can reshape behavior instantly, how accountability forces reflection, and how the awareness of authority amplifies the significance of every hidden detail. Every subtle gesture, every hesitation in speech, and every flicker of emotion spoke volumes about the weight of being held responsible, about the sudden understanding that actions have consequences that extend beyond personal perception and into the realm of professional and social judgment. It was clear that authority alone, when exercised with presence and awareness, can unravel carefully constructed facades and force individuals to confront realities they would rather ignore. There is a certain immediacy to accountability that cannot be replicated through warnings, discussions, or hypothetical scenarios. It manifests most powerfully when the observer holds genuine influence and the stakes are tangible. In this case, the revelation of the secret holiday became more than just an exposure of personal behavior. It became a lesson in the tangible impact of authority, showing how one's actions are invariably linked to external oversight. I noticed the subtle but profound shift in his demeanor as the realization of this interconnectedness sank in. The casual composure he had maintained was replaced by a heightened self-awareness, a careful recalibration of responses, and an acute sensitivity to the consequences that were no longer abstract but immediate and unavoidable. Every interaction, every word, and every decision following that moment was reframed by the awareness that accountability was present, that choices were being observed, and that the hidden actions of the past could no longer be dismissed or overlooked. It was fascinating to see how quickly the power of authority transformed the dynamic, how swiftly a sense of control shifted from the person who had sought to conceal the truth to the person who now held the perspective and oversight to enforce accountability. The lesson was clear: secrecy can only persist in the absence of observation and authority, and when those elements converge, the consequences are immediate, unavoidable, and instructive. The interplay between hidden intentions and external oversight illuminated the broader truth about responsibility, the undeniable reality that actions, no matter how carefully hidden, are always subject to evaluation, and that accountability, when exercised with presence and clarity, has the power to shift dynamics, reshape behavior, and demand reflection. In witnessing this, I recognized how authority not only exposes truth but also shapes responses, forces reconsideration, and amplifies the impact of every choice made in secrecy. The presence of his boss, in particular, underscored the practical implications of accountability in real-world terms, showing that it is not merely a theoretical concept, but a tangible force that demands attention, influences outcomes, and transforms interpersonal dynamics, turning deception into a moment of reckoning and reflection, and highlighting the inevitability of consequences when transparency meets oversight. The lessons about honesty, trust, and assumptions became impossible to ignore. As the events unfolded, it is one thing to suspect that someone is hiding something, and it is another to see the truth exposed in real time, with all the consequences laid bare in front of you. The moment I uncovered his secret holiday plans, I realized that trust, once broken or circumvented, carries a weight that cannot easily be erased. Trust is a fragile construct, built over time through consistency, transparency, and reliability, and yet it can be undermined in an instant by a single hidden action. In his case, the holiday that he had meticulously concealed was more than just a personal choice. It was a breach of the implicit understanding that actions, even small ones, should be conducted with honesty and respect toward those who rely on transparency. The assumptions I had made about our relationship, about the reliability of his words and intentions, were suddenly thrown into question, forcing me to reevaluate not only the specific instance, but the broader dynamics that had allowed such a deception to exist. Assumptions are particularly dangerous because they create blind spots. We assume people act in accordance with certain principles, that they will behave predictably based on past patterns, and that the boundaries of honesty and integrity will be respected. When these assumptions are violated, it is not just the specific act that is revealed, it is also the vulnerability inherent in the trust we place in others, the gaps in our perception that allow hidden actions to persist unnoticed. In observing the fallout from his secret holiday, I began to understand how crucial honesty is in maintaining the foundation of any relationship or interaction. Honesty is not merely a moral guideline, it is a practical necessity for ensuring that expectations align with reality and that actions do not undermine the stability of trust that relationships rely upon. When someone attempts to bypass honesty, it forces others to question the very fabric of what has been taken for granted, creating tension, doubt, and a need for reassessment. The revelation also highlighted the assumptions he had made about my awareness and perception. He had believed that his actions would go unnoticed, that deception could be sustained without consequence, and that the narrative he constructed could stand unchallenged. These assumptions proved to be dangerously flawed, demonstrating that underestimating the acuity, attentiveness, and agency of others is a fundamental miscalculation. In that moment, I realized how often people operate under faulty assumptions, assuming that secrecy is impenetrable, that intentions can be concealed, and that the consequences of dishonesty will be avoided. The unfolding events served as a stark reminder that assumptions must be tested, that vigilance is required to maintain awareness, and that honesty functions as both a personal ethic and a relational necessity. Trust, once compromised, reshapes interactions in profound ways. The subtle shifts in communication, the reconsideration of previous statements, and the heightened scrutiny that follows a breach of honesty all underscore the long-lasting impact of deception. Each moment of exposure, every instance in which hidden actions are revealed, provides a lesson in how fragile assumptions can be and how vital transparency is to sustaining meaningful connections. Furthermore, the situation underscored the importance of accountability as a complement to honesty and trust. Honesty alone is insufficient if it is not reinforced by the knowledge that actions are observable and that breaches carry consequences. Trust is sustained not only by intentions, but by verifiable actions, and assumptions must always be tempered by awareness of potential discrepancies between words and behavior. The secret holiday, therefore, was more than an isolated incident. It became a case study in human behavior, in the interplay between deception, revelation, and the recalibration of expectations. Each response, each reaction, and each realization that followed illustrated how trust can be undermined, assumptions can fail, and honesty must be actively maintained rather than passively presumed. Observing this dynamic allowed for a deeper understanding of the principles at stake, the fragility of interpersonal reliability, and the profound effect that one hidden action can have on the perception, confidence, and expectations of those involved. It reinforced the necessity of questioning assumptions, valuing honesty, and recognizing that trust is not an inherent guarantee, but a construct that requires continual validation, vigilance, and alignment between words and actions, and that any deviation from this alignment creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate act of concealment. The ripple effect of one bold move on everyone involved became astonishingly clear as the situation continued to unfold. When I decided to confront his secret holiday by bringing his boss into the picture, I knew it would create immediate tension, but I had not fully anticipated the depth of consequences that would cascade from that single action. One act, calculated and deliberate, had the power to shift relationships, alter perceptions, and leave a lasting impression on everyone in the environment. The first wave of impact was immediate and visceral. His own reaction, the mixture of shock, embarrassment, and the frantic search for control, set the tone for everything that followed. People instinctively respond to displays of vulnerability and exposure, and in this case, the revelation of his hidden holiday created an environment charged with emotional intensity. Observing the subtleties of body language, the shifts in tone, and the rapid recalibration of behavior was a lesson in human dynamics, a real-time study of how a single revelation can force multiple individuals to reassess their understanding, expectations, and relationships. Beyond his immediate response, the presence of his boss added an additional layer of significance. Authority, when combined with revelation, amplifies the effects of exposure. The subtle influence of professional power reshaped the social landscape, creating new boundaries, expectations, and an implicit hierarchy that affected not just the person caught in the act, but also everyone witnessing the encounter. It was a reminder that bold actions rarely exist in isolation. They intersect with context, relationships, and external forces, creating a complex network of cause and effect. The second layer of ripple was interpersonal. Friends, colleagues, and others who became aware of the situation began. I noticed how rumors, the boldness of taking deliberate action, and the responsibility that accompanied it created a heightened sense of agency, an understanding that deliberate choices carry both risk and influence. Observing the resulting dynamics allowed me to gauge the impact of strategic decisions, the significance of timing, and the intricate ways in which personal initiative can shape outcomes for multiple individuals simultaneously. There was an unexpected dimension to the ripple effect, the long-term recalibration of expectations. People began to recognize that actions have consequences beyond their immediate sphere, that hidden intentions can surface with dramatic effect, and that transparency and accountability are not just abstract principles, but forces that influence behavior and relationships in concrete ways. Even casual observers of the event were subtly affected, their assumptions about human behavior, secrecy, and trust shifting in response to what they witnessed. The social ecosystem had been irrevocably altered by one calculated intervention, demonstrating that boldness, when exercised thoughtfully, is transformative not only for the person being confronted, but for the broader network of interactions. Each ripple, whether emotional, social, or psychological, reinforced the principle that a single, deliberate act can create cascading effects, changing perceptions, influencing behavior, and reshaping the environment in ways that cannot easily be reversed. The realization that one moment could have such extensive influence underscored the responsibility inherent in taking bold action, the need for careful planning, and the profound potential for strategic interventions to create meaningful, lasting change across multiple layers of interaction. Observing this in real time highlighted the interplay between courage, consequence, and context, and demonstrated the remarkable power of a single act to ripple outward, touching every person and relationship involved in ways both visible and subtle, immediate and enduring.